Picture this. It's 1971 at Atlanta Dragway, and a Georgia farmer pulls up to the starting line in what looks like a standard Pontiac GTO. The hood opens and seasoned racers stop mid-conversation. Sitting on top of that 455 cubic inch engine is something Pontiac never built, never sanctioned, and according to their engineers, never needed: a towering tunnel ram intake crowned with two massive Holley carburetors. The other drivers are running factory-blessed setups, following Pontiac's playbook to the letter. But Arnie Beswick? He's about to prove that sometimes the best engineering comes from a farm workshop, not a corporate design studio. This is the story of how one stubborn Georgian outsmarted Pontiac's entire engineering department and created the most devastating, naturally aspirated 455 the drag strip had ever seen. While Pontiac insisted their engines didn't need tunnel ram technology, Beswick was in his shop proving them wrong, 1/4 mile at a time. To understand why Beswick's creation was so revolutionary, we need to understand what Pontiac was thinking in 1971. The company had just released their massive 455 cubic inch V8, the largest displacement engine in their history. This wasn't just big, it was monumentally big. The bore measured 4.15 inches, the stroke stretched to 4.21 inches. The result was 455 cubic inches of American thunder. OUTSMARTED and Pontiac's engineers had designed this beast with a very specific philosophy. They believed in torque, not revs. They believed in simplicity, not complexity. And most importantly, they believed their single 4-barrel carburetor setup was all anyone would ever need. The standard 455 HO came with a Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor sitting on a cast-iron intake manifold. It made 335 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and a stump-pulling 480 lb-ft of torque at just 3,600 RPM. For street cars, this was perfect. The engine pulled like a freight train from idle to redline. But here's where it gets interesting. While Pontiac was content with their single-carb setup, Chevrolet and Chrysler were deep into tunnel ram development. Chevy's Z28 Camaros were running cross-ram intakes. Mopar had their legendary Max wedge rams. These tall, dual-carburetor setups were dominating superstock classes across the country. The principle was simple but brilliant. Those long intake runners created a tuning effect. At specific RPM ranges, the air columns in those runners would resonate, literally ramming extra air into the cylinders. It was like natural supercharging, our NHN and Pontiac's official position. Their engines didn't need it. The 455's massive displacement and long stroke meant it was already making tremendous torque. Why complicate things with exotic induction? Their engineers argued that the 455's port design and combustion chambers were optimized for single 4-barrel carburation. Adding a tunnel ram would upset the careful balance they'd engineered. Enter Arnie Beswick, better known as Chish the Farmer. This wasn't some weekend warrior with a socket set and a dream. Beswick had been racing since the 1950s, starting with a 1957 Chevy that he'd transformed into a record-setting machine. By 1971, he'd switched to Pontiacs and was running a successful speed shop in Roswell, Georgia. But more importantly, he understood something that corporate engineers often miss. Racing isn't about following the manual, it's about finding every possible advantage within the rules. The Superstock rules in 1971 allowed certain modifications, including aftermarket intake manifolds. While Pontiac wasn't making tunnel rams, the aftermarket was. Companies like Edelbrock and Wyand were producing aluminum tunnel ram manifolds that would bolt onto Pontiac's 455. But here's the thing, nobody was really using them on Pontiacs. The conventional wisdom said Pontiac engines didn't respond well to tunnel rams. The port angles were wrong. The combustion chambers weren't designed for it. The camshaft profiles weren't aggressive enough. And Beswick didn't buy any of it. In his shop, away from prying eyes, he began experimenting. The tunnel ram he chose wasn't just tall, It was massive. The intake runners stretched nearly 14 inches from the carburetor mounting pads to the cylinder head ports. This created an air column that would resonate at very specific frequencies. The math was critical. Runner length, diameter, and taper all had to work together. Get it wrong, and you'd have a dog that wouldn't pull below 5,000 RPM. Get it right, and you'd have a naturally aspirated monster. And in the first challenge was carburation. Beswick mounted 2 Holley 750 CFM 4-barrel carburetors on top of that tunnel ram. That's 1,500 CFM of theoretical flow, enough to feed a pro stock engine. But raw airflow wasn't the goal. Those 2 carburetors had to work in perfect synchronization. The primary throttle plates had to open together. The secondaries had to kick in at exactly the same moment. The float levels had to be identical. Even a minor variation would cause one cylinder bank to run rich while the other ran lean. And what in end-jetting was a nightmare. With a single carburetor, you're dealing with one set of jets, one accelerator pump, one power valve. With dual quads, everything doubles. Beswick spent weeks on the dyno, changing jets 2 sizes at a time, reading spark plugs, monitoring exhaust temperatures. The front carburetor needed different jetting than the rear because of airflow dynamics. The outboard throttle bores needed different calibration than the inboard bores. But the real secret was in the camshaft. Pontiac's factory cams were designed for low-end torque and street manners. Even their most aggressive hydraulic cam, the 068, was done by 5,500 RPM. Beswick knew that tunnel rams needed RPM to work their magic. He commissioned a custom solid lifter camshaft with specs that would make Pontiac engineers cringe. The duration stretched to 320 degrees on the intake, 328 on the exhaust. The lift soared to 580 inches with 1.65.1 rocker arms. The lobe separation angle tightened to 106 degrees for maximum overlap. This wasn't a street cam. At idle, the engine loped like it had a misfire. Below 3,000 RPM, it was a dog. The vacuum reading at idle was so low that power brakes wouldn't work. But something magical happened at 4,500 RPM. The engine transformed. Those long runners began to resonate. The air columns started ramming. The dyno needle began climbing in ways that shouldn't have been possible with natural aspiration. Let me explain what was actually happening inside that engine. As each intake valve opened, it created a pressure wave that traveled up through the intake runner. With a conventional intake, that wave dissipates quickly. But with those 14-inch runners, the wave would bounce off the carburetor throttle plate and travel back down toward the valve. If you time it right, and this is where runner length becomes critical, that reflected wave arrives just as the intake valve is closing. It literally rams extra air into the cylinder, creating a supercharging effect without any moving parts. The resonance peaked at 6,800 RPM. At that speed, the pressure waves were perfectly synchronized with valve timing. The dyno showed something that shouldn't have been possible: 650 horsepower from a naturally aspirated 455. That's 1.43 horsepower per cubic inch, a specific output that matched or exceeded the best NASCAR engines of the era. For comparison, a factory 455 HO made 0.74 horsepower per cubic inch. Beswick had nearly doubled the specific output, but horsepower was only part of the story. The torque curve was equally impressive. While it sacrificed low-end grunt, the engine maintained over 500 lb-ft from 4,500 to 6,500 RPM. That broad, flat torque curve meant the engine pulled hard through the entire quarter mile. In superstock trim, with the car's weight factored to class requirements, Beswick's Tunnel Ram GTO was running 10.20s at 134 Melbourne poik. The factory single-carb cars? They were a full second slower. The compression ratio had been bumped to 12.5:1 using forged pistons. This was about as high as you could go with the gasoline available in 1971. Any higher and detonation would destroy the engine. The cylinder heads received extensive porting and polishing, with the intake ports enlarged to 2.11 inches and the exhaust ports opened to 1.77 inches. The valve sizes grew too, 2.11-inch intakes and 1.77-inch exhausts, the absolute maximum that would fit in Pontiac's combustion chambers. The bottom end was built to survive 7,500 RPM pulls. Forged steel rods replaced the factory cast pieces. ARP bolts held everything together. The main caps were a line honed for perfect bearing clearances. The oil system was modified with a high-volume pump and a deep sump pan to prevent oil starvation during hard launches. Every clearance was set for high RPM operation, tighter than stock to maintain oil pressure, but with enough room for thermal expansion. Now, here's where Beswick got really clever. He didn't just show up at the track with this monster, he kept it hidden. During warm-ups and time trials, he'd run with a conventional hood scoop that concealed the tunnel ram. Only when elimination rounds began would he remove the scoop, revealing those twin hollies reaching for the sky. By then, it was too late for competitors to adjust their strategies. The psychological effect was devastating. Imagine you're lined up against what you think is a typical 455 Pontiac. You've raced them before. You know their weaknesses. Then the hood opens, and you see this aluminum skyscraper with two massive carburetors. You know you're in trouble before the tree even drops. Word spread quickly through the super stock ranks. Beswick's fierce secret weapon became the most feared car in the class. Other Pontiac racers tried to duplicate his setup, but most failed. They'd bolt on a tunnel ram, jet it rich, and wonder why it didn't run. Word spread quickly through the super stock ranks. Beswick's fierce secret weapon became the most feared car in the class. Other Pontiac racers tried to duplicate his setup, but most failed. They'd bolt on a tunnel ram, jet it rich, and wonder why it didn't run. They didn't understand the complete system. The cam timing, the compression, the headwork, the precise carburetor synchronization. It wasn't just parts, it was engineering. And Pontiac's reaction was interesting. Officially, they maintained that tunnel rams weren't necessary for their engines. Unofficially, their engineers were taking notes. Internal memos from the period show they were aware of Beswick's success. Some engineers pushed for a factory tunnel ram development program. The bean counters killed it. Tunnel rams were race-only parts with no street application. Pontiac was trying to clean up its outlaw image, not fuel it, but the damage was done. Beswick had proven that Pontiac's engines were capable of far more than the factory claimed. The 455's architecture, those big bore centers, the generous port volumes, the robust bottom end, was perfect for tunnel ram applications. It just took a farmer from Georgia to prove it. The technical achievement becomes even more impressive when you consider the era. This was 1971. There were no computer simulations to optimize runner length, no flow benches in every speed shop, no wideband oxygen sensors to perfect air-fuel ratios. Beswick did this with experience, intuition, and countless hours of trial and error. He'd make a change, run the car, read the plugs, and make another change. It was old-school engineering at its finest. And the tunnel ram also exposed something interesting about engine design philosophy. Pontiac engineers had optimized the 455 for one specific application, strong, reliable street performance. They'd succeeded brilliantly, but in doing so, they'd left enormous potential on the table. Beswick's tunnel ram didn't just add power, it revealed power that was always there, waiting to be unlocked. And the influence extended beyond just Pontiac racing. Beswick's success inspired other racers to experiment with unconventional combinations. If a tunnel ram could work on a Pontiac 455, what about other unsuitable engines? The Ford 460, the Buick 455, the Oldsmobile 455. Within a year, tunnel rams were appearing on all kinds of big blocks that their manufacturers never intended to wear them. Once in the setup also challenged conventional wisdom about naturally aspirated power. In 1971, the accepted rule was about 1 horsepower per cubic inch for a good street engine, maybe 1.2 for a race engine. Beswick's 1.43 horsepower per cubic inch shattered those expectations. It showed that with the right combination of parts and tuning, naturally aspirated engines could compete with the supercharged and nitrous-injected cars starting to appear. But let's talk about what it was like to actually drive this beast. First, starting it was an adventure. The high compression and radical cam meant it needed to spin fast to fire. The starter motor would groan under the load. Once running, it idled at 1,200 RPM. Any lower, and it would stall. The clutch was brutal, a sintered iron disc that was either engaged or not, no slipping allowed. Nutting down and launching required a specific technique. Too low RPM and the engine would bog. Too high, and you'd smoke the tires past the 60-foot mark. The sweet spot was 4,800 RPM, right where the tunnel ram began to work its magic. Drop the clutch, and the car would squat hard, the front end rising as 650 horsepower tried to twist the chassis into a pretzel. First gear was gone in 1.2 seconds. Second gear disappeared almost as quickly. By the time you grabbed third, you were already past 100 mmHg and climbing fast. And around the sound was unlike any other Pontiac. The factory 455s had a deep, throaty rumble. Beswick's tunnel ram car screamed. Those twin hollies sucking air created a banshee wail that could be heard over the entire track. When both carburetors transitioned to their secondaries at 5,200 RPM, it sounded like a jet engine spooling up. Other racers said they could tell when Beswick was making a pass just by the sound, even from the pits. And maintenance was constant. Those 12.51 pistons demanded 104-octane racing gas. Nothing less would prevent detonation. The valve springs were so stiff they'd start to fatigue after just 50 passes. Beswick would change them preventively every 40 runs. The dual carburetors needed constant attention. Changes in weather, altitude, or humidity required rejetting. A typical race day meant pulling the carburetors at least twice for adjustments. The spark plugs told the story of each run. Beswick would pull all 8 after every pass, reading them like tea leaves. A white insulator meant too lean, dangerous territory that could melt pistons. Dark brown or black meant too rich. Safe, but slow. The perfect light tan color, with just a hint of color change at the tip, meant the mixture was perfect. But perfect was a moving target that changed with every atmospheric variation. And the economic impact was significant too. While a factory 455 HO cost about $500 as an option, Beswick's tunnel ram setup added another $3,000 in 1971 dollars. The tunnel ram manifold alone was $400. Each Holley carburetor was $200. The custom camshaft was $300. The forged pistons, rods, and crank added another $2,500. The headwork was $600. In today's money, that's about $22,000 in modifications for a naturally aspirated engine, but for serious superstock racers, it was worth every penny. Prize money at major events could reach $5,000. Contingency sponsors added more. A successful season could gross $30,000 or more. Plus, there was the invaluable marketing benefit. Beswick's speed shop saw business triple after his tunnel ram success became known. Racers from across the Southeast would trailer their cars to Georgia just to have Nacho, the farmers, work his magic. The tunnel ram setup also forced an evolution in transmission technology. The factory Muncie M22 Urbali Rock Crusher 4-speed was tough, but the violent 7,500 RPM shifts eventually broke them. Beswick switched to a modified Chrysler 833 4-speed sacrilege in a Pontiac, but necessary for survival. The clutch went through several iterations before settling on a 3-disc setup from Schaefer that could handle the brutal engagement needed for consistent launches. The rear axle was another weak point exposed by the tunnel ram's power. The factory 12-bolt positraction would twist the axle tubes under hard launches. Beswick had a custom Ford 9-inch rear end built with 35 spline axles and a spool instead of a differential. The 4.81 gears were optimal for the quarter mile, allowing the engine to stay in its power band through the traps. Junction safety equipment had to evolve too. The NHRA required a full roll cage for cars running under 11 seconds. The tunnel ram car needed more, a funny car-style cage with door bars and a roof hoop. The drive shaft was enclosed in a steel loop to prevent it from pole vaulting the car if it broke. A scattered clutch could be lethal, so an aluminum bell housing with a thick steel insert became mandatory. And what really set Beswick apart wasn't just the tunnel ram itself, but his systematic approach to development. He kept detailed notes on every run, weather conditions, track temperature, 60-foot times, shift points, MPH at various track markers. This data revealed patterns. The tunnel ram performed best when track temperature was between 80 and 95 degrees. Below that, the dense air required richer jetting. Above that, the thin air needed leaner mixtures and more ignition advance. He discovered that humidity affected the tunnel ram more than conventional intakes. Water vapor in the air changed the resonance frequency of those long runners. On humid days, the power peak would shift down by 200 RPM. This meant adjusting shift points to compensate. Missing the shift point by even 300 RPM could cost 3/10 in the quarter mile. The tunnel ram also revealed weaknesses in Pontiac's oiling system that only appeared at sustained high RPM. The factory oil pump would cavitate above 7,000 RPM, causing momentary pressure drops. Beswick modified the pump with tighter clearances and a stiffer pressure relief spring. He also added an AccuSump, a pneumatic accumulator that would maintain oil pressure during hard launches when oil sloshed away from the pickup. Non-gun cooling was another challenge. The tunnel ram's height meant a conventional fan wouldn't fit. Beswick ran electric fans, unusual for 1971, but necessary for packaging. The radiator was a custom aluminum piece with dual passes to maximize cooling efficiency. Even so, the engine would heat soak between rounds, requiring careful cool-down procedures to maintain consistency. The influence of Beswick's tunnel ram success rippled through the industry in unexpected ways. Aftermarket manufacturers began developing Pontiac-specific tunnel rams instead of just adapting Chevy designs. Cam grinders created new profiles specifically for tunnel ram applications. Even carburetor companies started offering a Tour tunnel ram calibration kits with the proper jets, power valves, and accelerator pump cams. Natchitoishtia and some of Pontiac's own engineers privately admitted that Beswick had embarrassed them. Here was a privateer proving their engines were capable of far more than the factory ever extracted. It highlighted a fundamental tension in Detroit, engineers who wanted to push boundaries versus executives who wanted to minimize warranty claims and maintain profit margins. In the tunnel ram 455 also became a symbol of something larger, the idea that innovation doesn't always come from corporate R&D departments. Sometimes it comes from individuals who refuse to accept conventional limitations. Beswick didn't have Pontiac's resources, their dynos, their test facilities, but he had something more valuable, the freedom to experiment without committee approval. And then by 1973, the party was largely over. Insurance rates for high-performance cars had skyrocketed. Emissions regulations were tightening. Pontiac discontinued the 455 HO, and the super stock classes were evolving toward purpose-built race cars rather than modified production vehicles. But for a brief, shining moment, a Georgia farmer had shown the world what was possible when engineering curiosity met racing ambition. The legacy lives on today. Original tunnel ram 455s are among the most coveted engines in Pontiac collecting circles. A documented Beswick-built engine can add $50,000 to a car's value. The tunnel ram manifolds themselves, especially the early Edelbrock and Y pieces, sell for $3,000 or more when they surface. Modern Pontiac builders still study Beswick's combination, using contemporary technology to refine what he pioneered with slide rules and spark plug readings. Entretien modern dyno testing has validated Beswick's work. With today's better fuels and precision machining, builders have pushed naturally aspirated 455s past 700 horsepower using evolved versions of his tunnel ram formula. Electronic fuel injection has replaced the temperamental Hollies. Roller camshafts have superseded flat tappets. But the fundamental concept, using runner length to create resonance tuning, remains unchanged. The story also raises interesting questions about missed opportunities. What if Pontiac had embraced tunnel ram technology? What if they'd released a factory superstock package with a warranty-backed tunnel ram 455? Could they have dominated NHRA competition the way Chrysler did with their Max Wedge and Hemi programs? We'll never know, but Beswick proved the potential was there. In the end, Arnie reared the farmer. Beswick's tunnel ram 455 represents something profound about American hot rodding. It's the story of an individual who looked at corporate engineering and said, I can do better. Not with millions in development money, not with teams of engineers, but with curiosity, determination, and a willingness to challenge accepted wisdom. L'Entraîne, the tunnel ram 455, proved that Pontiac's engines were world-class platforms held back only by conservative factory development. It showed that massive, naturally aspirated power was possible without exotic cylinder heads or racing blocks. Most importantly, it demonstrated that innovation in automotive performance doesn't require corporate backing. Sometimes all it takes is a Georgia farmer with a wild idea and the courage to pursue it. And today, when we see modern cars making 700-plus horsepower from the factory, it's easy to forget how revolutionary Beswick's 650 horsepower, naturally aspirated 455 was in 1971. This was an era when a 400-horsepower factory car was considered extreme. Beswick didn't just push the envelope, he tore it open and showed everyone what was inside. The tunnel ram 455 remains a testament to American ingenuity, a reminder that the best engineering solutions don't always come from where you'd expect. Sometimes they come from a farmer's workshop in Georgia, where conventional wisdom goes to die and horsepower is born. Beswick didn't just outsmart Pontiac, he showed them what their own engine was truly capable of, 1/4 mile at a time. What's the most impressive engine build you've ever encountered? Was it a factory masterpiece, or a privateer's creation that defied the odds? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of drag racing's most legendary David versus Goliath tales, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started exploring the incredible stories of individuals who refused to accept limits and changed motorsports forever. Until next time, keep those engines screaming, and remember, sometimes the best engineering comes from the most unexpected places.